Hello, everybody. We are live, and with us is Jonas. And this is composable without compromise. And composable can mean a whole bunch of different things, and we'll likely see a slightly different direction that we have sometimes seen with what we think of composable, or maybe not. This is why this is so much fun. So, Jonas, would you mind telling us who you are, where you work,
Sure.
what you do, all that fun stuff?
Yeah, for sure. So I try to keep it short but succinct. So basically, I've started working with HTML and with the web in school. So in, I think, 10th class in Germany it is. So I'm based in Germany. We had some first courses where you could opt to learn about stuff like that. And I found that super interesting and pretty much been fixed to that since. So I've moved to another city for my studies. So I've studied computer science in Bonn, the former capital of Germany, where I've also met great people. And I think pretty much after a year, we already founded our first company with colleagues from the studies. So that
Wow.
was the nucleus, I'd say, of everything we're doing today, because we're pretty much in that lineage still. We've been an agency for the longest time. So I think until 2 or 3 years ago, we were still working on an agency business doing PHP-based development,
All
a whole
right.
lot of front-end development too. That was always part of our DNA, to have really great quality front-end in combination with those CMS and backend systems. So that was what we've started with. And then we've gradually realized that this is not really getting better for us. Nobody
Hmm.
actually wants to pay for the kind of work we were doing when doing quality work, because you want to have fast results, you want to have efficient and most of all cheap results. In our space, at least for the longest time, was our impression. So we've thought hard about what could we do, what is our real expertise, where is our real passion, and that's the front end, always has been the front
Yeah.
end. And we've done some big projects for German clients building such systems for telcos and stuff. So it was natural to us to really have a look at our own component library, what we've called it back then, a component library in Pattern Lab, that we've repurposed in all our client projects, and how we could make that more accessible for others too, because building a design system is a huge upfront investment.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
everybody can shoulder that, and not everybody has the specialist knowledge to do that. So that's why we've switched to that model, I think 2 years ago, pretty much, by building a product, an open source starter kit for design systems that you
Mhm.
can use to build out your own design system, and hopefully have those effects without investing those years of developing time and
Exactly.
knowledge and finding the people and so on. So I think that's the pretty gist of it.
And so Kickstart DS is essentially the company that you started to get this design system out there with all its components and
Yes.
stuff. All right, cool.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, it's a brand of our agency. So we still have
Mhm.
the agency in the back. So we're still
Okay.
doing some consultancy work, especially in that context of design systems. We're helping people build out design systems based on Kickstart.ds. So all of that is still in the background there in that agency business, but the brand Kickstart.ds is really 100% focused on the design system part and the open source stuff on GitHub and so on. So
Okay, great. And that actually works pretty well for this stream because you are actually still doing work for customers
yeah,
specific to how they want to work. And also
exactly.
have this product that is basically a composable design system, right?
Yeah.
And so, generally in this stream where we do composable without compromise, we have a bunch of the same questions, and we want to see what different people in the space, like you or someone else, actually has to say on these questions in their
Mhm.
context. So, I'm just going to shoot with the first one. So, what is an unexpected or surprising outcome of transitioning from a monolithic to a composable architecture?
Mhm. I think that's a really interesting question, because I think you have to ask yourself, why do I transition? That should be the first thing,
Mhm.
because there's always a reason to transition. Hopefully, you're not doing it just because, or just because you've read about it online and you think it's the next big thing, so I should be part of it. You should have a reason to transition. And I mean, those reasons often carry the unexpected or surprising parts, like maybe you're changing your team structure for that, going from a monolith to a more composable architecture. You maybe have more
Yeah.
teams that are working for themselves, which is great for them because it really empowers them. But it's harder to have a broader overview over your software, over your services that you offer, when you have those distinct teams and not that top-down view of a monolith that is one, I mean, it's hard to call it a positive because monoliths have really big problems in my view, but it is one positive that you can have the overview over everything.
Even if you don't understand it, you at least
Yeah.
see where everything sits and behaves, right?
Yeah.
And so when you were working with your agency and you onboarded people into this new way of thinking, was there anything that surprised you either from what they had to say about it or what came out or what surprised you about yourself that you maybe even liked monoliths sometimes? Do you have anything there?
I think the most surprising thing was how varied the reaction to all those ideas was. And it totally depends on the org's process, on the specific people you're talking to. Sometimes you have someone really opinionated that's totally set in how he does everything, and you won't have a good time convincing him if it's, so, for example, a technical argument. So that can be really surprising. Or maybe you think you're talking to the correct people, but in the end you're talking to the marketing department and not to the real engineering department. So everything you're doing is kind of in a vacuum. So I think realizing those structures can be really important, and is often surprising that when you realize who the real gatekeepers in an organization are when it comes to those types of decisions. And how they are driven, because they can be really political, and you can have pushback because changing something often means taking something away from someone, changing someone's responsibilities or his freedom of choice, and that is always something which will have friction, I think. And that can be really surprising, that it's not that easy. Just because it's a good idea, you won't run into open doors necessarily.
Exactly. I always love how people like you and I that have been doing this with this kind of stuff for a long, long time, that we kind of just go in and say, this speaks for itself, right? Let's just do it. And then you might be surprised by the pushback because it probably doesn't speak for itself. It might not be as easy as we see it because we've just done it for a long time,
exactly.
Right?
And I mean, you just have to communicate with people. It's not that it's not possible to win those people over. You just have to speak to them on their eye level. So then you can really see what are the advantages that they see in their way of doing it. Why do they resist this? And this can be really, really helpful to understand your organization too and your processes.
Exactly. And so I know that we have our friend Booba in the stream, and he also works at an agency, and this is basically his daily life. So that makes it really interesting to see if anyone that is watching here has some questions. Feel free to also add these. So with all this in mind, right, speaking to either other companies or people you work with, like, do you have something you might wanted to say to people in that space that either work maybe at an agency or at a SaaS company building this kind of stuff, and maybe in your context even like people who are in charge at a customer, for example?
Yeah, I mean, one thing coming from our perspective, which might be obvious, is have a look at how it integrates with your front-end workflows. How does all this composability work out for your needs when it comes to creating web pages, apps, and so on? Which capacities do you have in your developers? Can they do React? A lot of companies don't have developers that can do, for example, React or Vue.js or Angular. So they are pretty set in the current technologies, and they can't just change from one day to the other. So I'd say have a real hard look at the technologies involved, at the stakeholders involved, and see if it matches. Because when it matches, it can be really liberating and really unlock production and capacity and efficiency for you and your teams, if you're using those specific advantages that the composable architecture brings to the table, I think.
And so when you let's take a slight sidetrack here, because let's say you have a design system that's of course has all the rules about how things work design wise. Couldn't you just make those HTML snippets that somehow people just could put in their ancient old school systems? Would that also work?
Yeah, I mean, and actually that is a way that we, when we're talking about Kickstarter, totally support out of the box, because everything in the end, from our perspective, still is just HTML, and we've never changed that view of how the web works. So React for us always was just a replacement for handlebars, what we've used before.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
A functional templating layer. It's not meant to do anything for us than giving us great templating capabilities to get that composability, because I'd say it's really hard to compose your design system from different sources when you're talking about buying 5 components on that marketplace, then mixing them with your custom components and then just adding some open source components. I don't think that will ever work when you're concerned about consistency and performance and all of that stuff. So you will have one design system, at least that's our view. So there's not a lot of composability between different systems in that sense. But every good design system is composable in itself. That's one of the main pillars of a design system, to have composable components that can be remixed for all your different needs, that serve as a base for rapid prototyping, for production stuff, and so on. So that should be super composable. And in that sense, it's also really compatible with composable architectures in the back, because if you have that divide between front end and back end, you can really have an opinionated front end, a really structured front end, without having some dependency on the back end or having to talk to people about this.
Exactly. And you can even make multiple front end channels with the same systems and then theme them up, for example. If you set it up correctly, you should.
And that would be one thing I also advise when you, as an agency or even as an SaaS company, look at this, to have an open eye for the new stuff that's unlocked by those composable architectures. It's not a one-to-one replacement. You have different complexities, different pros and cons, but there are definite pros that can enable great experiences when going that route. We just built one such app for a client that enables him to build his own e-commerce journeys completely from start to finish in different tenant designs. You can white label it. So it's really enabling a lot of different stakeholders for them, because it's thought from the beginning to be composable, to remix all those systems in that sector of industry and make it approachable in a low-code fashion, even a no-code fashion, a page builder drag and drop like way to stakeholders of that company, because it's composable and it's super liberating for them.
So without noticing it, you just pitched Uniform. So thank you for that.
I mean, that project really reminded me of Uniform too. I think I've spoke with Ante before, and I've mentioned it to him too, that I see a lot of similarities in that approach, just that you have to solve it way more generally.
Exactly. We are very agnostic to whatever. Right, our components are more data-driven in that sense, but you can still connect your design system to components in Uniform and drag and drop with them, and that still works. So, this kind of stuff fits well. And let's see, there is a comment. Booba agrees. Whoa, that's nice to hear. Anyway, so let's say if you could wave a magic wand and change anything in our current space, from front end to architectures to people working, what would it be? Or maybe nothing, because it's all fun.
I mean, I think it is all fun, but that doesn't mean you don't have stuff you want to change. And if you have no change, I don't think it will keep being fun. So you should have new stuff. So I think there's 2 things really I'm thinking about that I would like to change. One more nerdy thing and one more general thing I really care about, because I think we need more standardization in the front end space and more collaboration. Not that many silos where everything is redone every project. So at least to me, it's really tiring to see how much effort is put into front end to get the 200th version of a hero image that's not accessible, that doesn't had the right checks when being developed, because there's just no time to do it, and it's just the last thing that's done in a project. I think that's really something I'd like to see change, and I think before it can change, you have to have some way of standardization. I think GraphQL did great stuff for the backend. I think GraphQL did really great stuff for the backend there in normalizing how you can work with this stuff, and enables a lot of stuff that you see in the composable headless space today is, I think, enabled by APIs. I mean, REST was before that and enables much of the same stuff if you wanted to, but GraphQL just makes it way easier to interface with those things. And I think that's a bit lacking on the front end. There's not much there. So that maybe would be the more general thing.
That's a lovely one. We haven't heard that one, but that's awesome. I'm not sure this will ever happen, because front-end developers will never agree on anything.
Yeah,
I'm afraid. You know what? Funnily enough, in the end, it all comes down to you output HTML that looks a certain way.
Yeah.
And so you should somehow find some sort of standard, but it is a challenge. But you're
And
right.
my magic nerdy pick would
Mhm.
be just that, a tool that you can use to map arbitrary JSON objects. Maybe by a spec, by a schema, but that would enable a lot of that flexibility that you have in the GraphQL space already, where you can just take your component. You already have your component when you're doing your job right. You've thought about your component beforehand. You know which information should be displayed, which interactions there should be. That is nothing that's related to your backend systems, to your choice there. So you should be opinionated from the start, when at least following our way of doing it. So you would be just mapping that. And if you had a tool that just would allow you to have all those fields and just connect them into your component, and I think that's something Bupa
You keep
so
pitching
mentioned.
uniform. Please
I know.
continue.
I mean, the component starter pack, I think, really goes into that direction. And it's really
Yeah.
interesting for us too, because that enables that way of working with your design system, with your components, without losing all the possible benefits of using the design system, the consistency, the performance aspects, the efficiency in getting features from production to production. I mean, all this benefits from something like that. And I think we did a prototype early on that's really similar to the component starter back with you guys too, which already showed how nice that could be. So
yeah, because we are actually using stuff like JSON schema to validate all the data that comes in.
Yeah.
And what we do in Uniform now is where you can select all these different data sources and map whatever comes out of them, each field that you want, to a property of your component. And so you're almost curating your own GraphQL API.
Yeah, that's great.
And it outputs as JSON.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting thing when you map that to a JSON schema. So it's always relatively clean. And we're working on being able to actually even type that. And so then things get very strong.
I can quickly pitch Kickstart.ts again here, because that's just what we are doing too. We're just using JSON schema. And I'd say, if someone would ask me what's special about what we're doing, I'd say there's nothing special about it. We're trying to not be special. It should just be best practice. We're just doing stuff like you should do it. It shouldn't be surprising. The surprising aspect might be that we always start by defining component structure. And that's exactly done in JSON schema, to really have those thoughts beforehand. Before drawing something in Figma, you should talk to your editors. What do you need?
Exactly.
What do you actually need to display content on your website? Because if a designer thinks that up and then it goes through to a developer and he adds his own interpretation, and then at the end, just at the end, when everything's too late, it gets into the editor's hands, he will not be happy when it's not really enabling him. And I think that should be the
And
focus.
what about edge cases? How does that look? Like, there's so much stuff there that you need to think about. So this is actually a lovely bridge to our next question. Like, have you seen any sort of bottlenecks in this whole composable architecture? Like, it could even be, could be technical, or it could be like process related, or maybe people just don't get it. Like, what have you seen as a bottleneck in this whole new thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've hinted at it before, but I think staffing and knowledge transfer inside your own organization are really huge bottlenecks, because it's not that easy for developers to transition those roles necessarily. Some do it without problems. Others are really set into their ways of doing things and they don't want to change. And moving to such an architecture almost certainly means changing stuff, learning new stuff, and you have to have fun with that. If you don't have fun with that, you'll have a really hard time, I think. So I think that's a really big bottleneck, that you have to have the real talent in your org.
And it almost, to me, feels like doing composable either in your front end, but also as architectures on a whole. The how do you call this? I'm losing my English words. It's like you have to go over a line to actually get there. So there's more upfront thinking, ownership, taking it more into the customer's hands themselves, that they own it more. And so they have to learn more. And then after they have learned all the things, then it's smooth sailing. But
I mean, that's one of our main pitches too, that you have to enable the org to do the work. There's great value in having an agency that can do parts of that, but it has to be owned by the org, especially when you're talking about design systems. It's something we're never getting tired of mentioning. You have to own it yourself. You have to know what you want to do with this. You have to know the action plan. You have to know the arguments when people ask you, why should we continue building this design system? And this is really important, I think. So
Exactly. And luckily, I have recently seen, maybe the last year and a bit, that a lot of people that were at agencies that understand the stuff we're talking about are all moving to brands. And they're quite senior and they're taking ownership of the product at a brand on that level. And they can help you with a team buy-in. And I think when you talk about composable architectures, from the front end things to even the other stuff like how do CMSs connect together with something like Uniform, it is a team buy, and everybody needs to be there. And that on its own could be a bottleneck if people have different agendas.
Yeah, and I mean, often those are not the organizational structures you will find in those companies. So you will have the people gatekeeping stuff and so on. So it's really a challenge to get all the right people to the table, which is just the start.
Exactly. And this is also why we love using agencies to help out with a sale, because they also know what works and they can help with pitches and stuff. And so what stuff that was there as a feature in like super old tech would you like to bring back, if any?
I think there's something to be said about some classic front-end engineering jobs. Stuff like naming stuff, block element modifier as an example to approaching your semantics when creating markup. Vanilla JavaScript, it's really impressive what you can do today with just JavaScript itself when you're using ECMAScript 6 and so on. I think there is something lost inside the transition to single-page apps and front-end frameworks. If it's React, Vue.js, Angular, doesn't matter. It's just a different beast, and you're just a tad more removed from the real output in the end. And I don't think it's always a good thing. So for me personally, I'm just not a big fan, for example, of CSS and JS. I really like authoring my CSS for myself. I like reusing SaaS for that and finding really purpose-fit abstractions for what I'm building, because that should be really long-lasting. So it's worth the effort. It's worth it to think about naming, and it's worth it to think about semantics. It's not wasted time, in my eyes. You can really debate about this, I think, for hours at a time with people.
I think we might be dating ourselves, because I think exactly like you. I come from the world where we didn't have a jQuery or something like that. It all came later, and we just had to know all the tricks. And with that came good semantics and accessibility. And there was years where we just did everything with vanilla JavaScript, and it worked pretty well. But you have to understand everything and all the browser differences. So in my brain, there's a lot of CSS hacks that worked in IE6 that I don't need anymore, but they're still here. Right. And so the only difference is, like, right now, if you are younger and you're starting with your whole journey, you kind of don't have to know all the things, and you still have success. So like, it's almost ambiguous now with whatever framework you use, from Nuxt to Next to SvelteKit. Performance is almost no longer an issue because they have such good defaults. But if there's a bug and you haven't done that before, you cannot find it. You have to start diving into packages that you don't get. So there's pros and cons here, I guess.
One other thing I really miss are self-owned communities, user-run communities. I've loved going through PHP BB forums, through IRC servers way back when, and I think there's something lost there too in those specialized communities, those really grown communities. There are some out there, but I don't think it's the same. You can go to Reddit, but it's more sanitized, I think, and not that it lacks character, I think.
Do we still have a lot of forums out there? Does that still really exist?
I think there's specialist stuff, I know of my co-founder, he's really into watches, wristwatches, and that's, I think, one of those topics that's still mainly done in forums. So
really?
I think they are out there, but I have not encountered them the last years.
And maybe it's just all in Discord now.
Yeah, maybe. And I don't like that either, because it's also centralized and also pressed into that Discord format. It's not.
Yes. True.
I'm missing the self-expression you had on the web in the past. I think there is a lot less self-expression today.
All right, thank you for that. I love the insights that you have that are so similar to mine. Actually, doesn't always happen. That's cool. Okay, so this is the last question that we generally have in this round, and let's see if there's other stuff we could talk about. But
Sure.
how would you explain composable architectures to? Normally, you ask to, let's say, your grandma, but now I'm going to ask to a 15-year-old that supposed to be kind of digitally native, right? They when they were born, they used the mouse and a phone already.
Mhm.
So how would you explain composable architectures to them?
I think it's really hard because it's so complex that most analogies break down pretty early, I
Hmm.
think. But I probably try it with an analogy nonetheless. So something like when you're thinking of classroom assignments or stuff like that, and maybe you compare the teacher assigning you all the class one big task to create something, and everybody has his own subtasks already defined, so you're just working down a list, and in the end everything comes together and you have a great presentation with your class. That would be, I'd say, monolithic in approach. So you
Hmm.
have one person designing the thing, coordinating the thing, and a lot of people just working alongside that plan. And I'd say composable is more like having some maybe self-organized subgroups and more of a general task, and then you self-organize. So you have some small groups working on certain parts of it. You have maybe some techie guys in your class that like to approach one thing that they can do really good job at. For example, you have a show that you're starting and they can do the lighting. They do a really great light
Yeah,
show
exactly.
because they really get
Yeah.
into the topic. And this only gets enabled by having that composable structure, by having those specialized teams. And I'd say that would be maybe a way to get to the differences between something monolithic and something composable. Because in the composable part, you still also in your class would need someone to coordinate this. So how does that
Yeah.
work? And I think that would get someone, even if you're 15 years old, to think about exactly the challenges that we've talked about in this before, in the questions before, I think.
Yeah, and I tend to explain it, and that was one of our first guests that came up with
Mhm.
that. It's like, remember when you bought a mobile phone like a Nokia or something? It was just one OS. You cannot really personalize it other than some colors maybe. But
Mhm.
now when you have a phone like this, it comes with something, but you have all these, if I open it, you see all these little icons, right? And they're all the
Mhm.
apps that I have chosen. And you can just set it up the way you want to, but these
Yeah.
apps on their own are defined by people that are very smart and they just work.
Yeah.
And so you can reuse apps in different places. You can set it up yourself. And so it's almost like the owner of the device gets to choose how to use it, but the tools that they use, the DNA building blocks, are actually properly built.
And
And
even
this is,
there, you have quite an ecosystem backing all that and making it possible and usable for you, because
yeah,
you'd be quite dissatisfied if the share dialog wouldn't work the same for all those apps, or if the
exactly.
intents
And
wouldn't
that's
work
actually
and the
true.
correct app wouldn't open. So there's still some connective tissue behind that's
Yes.
making all that work. And I think that's also, just to get back to promoting uniform again, but where you would see uniform positioned. So you're pretty
Yeah, and
much the
so
operating system behind such a thing, making it possible to have composable stuff that works great in conjunction. So
and I think this is a lovely bridge to some other stuff that I want to talk to you about because you are relatively technical. You
yeah,
know how these front end components work. And you also know that if you have these components, you have to fill them up with data somehow.
yeah,
And we're talking about this connective tissue kind of thing, right? So you still have to do something.
yeah.
And we almost like to say we're the bookshelf and you put the books on. But
Mhm.
somehow you need to know where to place one book. And
Yeah,
so, what a lot of systems have, if you don't have something like uniform, you need to somehow code to write connections to other places. You have to resolve URLs and all these things, and then map that data so they fit to your components. And so, we like to call that glue code,
yeah.
right? And so, if you didn't know uniform, how
Mhm.
would you actually solve this glue code thing? If you were now an agency and you had a project with 6 sources with different places and it all had to fit into your component Kickstart DS
Yeah.
system, how would you solve that?
I mean, it's just manual labor, to be honest. When you want to have a really purpose fit solution, you just do it all by hand. write those resolvers, get all those data stuff out of there, probably use something like Next.js or another similar framework to have the base set up in place. But in theory, you would have to code everything yourself. So you would write the components, you connect up the data sources, but everything is done by a coder. And that's, in our experience, also one of the big, because we've talked about this before, bottlenecks that you see is when everything has to go through one team or one deployment process or one QA quality assurance phase, then it gets really slow and it gets really hard for people to innovate. And I think that's one part where you can really make a difference with those structures.
Yeah, because you can then ask the question. Let's say you have a hero banner with an image, a title, and a subtitle, and maybe a button. If a content editor says, "Can I use that component with a different set of data?" In that case, you actually have to make a ticket for the developers that actually then say, "Yeah, but I don't have time to add a new data source for you."
I mean, I've talked about that project before. I think with this composable e-commerce stuff. And this was the reason for them to do that project, because they had that bottleneck. They couldn't deliver. They have enough customers on their solution, on their white label solution, but they weren't just quick enough to deliver features to those clients. And those clients were not flexible enough inside their own systems when they wanted to be custom, when they wanted to personalize something. They were running into really hard edges. So that was the whole reason to think about something more composable, how to break all those barriers and rearrange everything so it gets to the stakeholder himself in the end.
Yeah, and what I like to see is to have a lot less of that code, where you would actually move all that, choosing which code or which data or which content goes to which place. That should actually happen in that connective tissue, right? And that's how, in the end, we came up with what we do at Uniform, is where you can literally just select any data resource to a composition or to a component, and you just find whatever title you want, you put it on the prop, and you hit save, and that comes out, and that's the only thing, and you don't actually have to query that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super smart.
It's
do it that way.
A lot of people say, yeah, but then you duplicate content and you put stuff on servers and you have to do caching. But in the end, now that we have edge rendering and all that stuff, it's not that hard anymore. It's actually very interesting to see where we use the CDN edge to store that little bit of data that you have selected yourself, your own curation essentially. And then you can, for each of those data sources, you can just set a TTL, let's say 30 seconds, 10 minutes, whatever you want. Or you can set up a webhook. So when somebody publishes that CMS item, a webhook is fired and Uniforms removes that little chunk from the edge. And then when you re-render, you don't have to do like a statically generated site anymore. It can be actually dynamic, that is just cached for a certain amount of time. And then looking at the CDN edge, and we've had demos where you had like 15 CMSs and search engines and whatever, 30 millisecond page load, 50 millisecond.
Yeah, that's
and
crazy.
it's a very interesting approach now that we have this whole edge thing going on.
Yeah.
And so before, this would have been a bottleneck because you would have to pay for servers to be up and do all the crazy stuff, no longer needed. And so that makes things much easier. And you do still need that tiny bit of code, because how would you solve that? Like, imagine you have a data source and you select a date, a title, and description, but that date is formatted in American and you need to have it in German. So you still need to do some sort of coding bit. That's the only area.
If you'd ask me, I'd say you probably, if you're a business that cares about multi-time zone stuff, you'd probably want to have that built into your component itself. So if you're displaying a date, you probably want to have that responsibility relegated to the component to either have a switch where you can just set which format you will want to render, or by having it choose automatically based on browser or something like that. But in the end, the data should be pure data. So you have a timestamp behind that.
Exactly.
So it wouldn't be a regional date that you're saving somewhere or that you're entering somewhere, but it would be a time zone, not time zone specific.
And so timestamp, what happens if that, let's say, is a little card component, right, from your design system, and sometimes it's a date and sometimes it says, get discount now. Then suddenly that doesn't fit anymore, because you don't want to have date logic in your component, I guess.
Yeah, and I would say if you have something that's either get a discount or the date, I don't think you've done a good job creating your component, because
Oh, here
those
we
are
go.
not things you should mix. You should have two properties for that. And maybe
Yeah.
to explain a bit our approach to creating
Yes,
components,
please.
because it can be illustrative for that. Because we built the starter kit for design systems, and it could be paradoxical to have such a thing, even because every page wants to be custom. You want to have your solution, and we advocate that too. So we just have some components for you with lots of properties already, which you can
Yeah.
choose from. But you wouldn't ever use all those properties. For example, when building your hero version of our visual component, you only pick the 3 or 4 you actually need. And you maybe even reduce the options. We maybe have 2 variants, you only need 1 variant. So you just use that variant. And in that process, you find your own component definition, your component API. And that in turn defines which fields, which slots your components have to connect to those backend systems, which is why I think this is a really natural fit. If you're thinking about your design system in that way, structuring your components by information displayed, by interactions possible, and have a strong definition for that, it gets really easy to convert that to different systems. In other projects, we use Gatsby, for example, because you've asked how we would approach that, and there you have resolvers you write. So
Yeah,
we
you have
just
the source plugins essentially.
yeah, and we just wrote
Yeah.
one big Kickstart.ds schema and just resolve all those sources against our own
Oh,
schema,
wow.
which then
Cool.
matches our component APIs automatically. So to connect a new source, you just add the source plugin, transform to our Kickstart.ds structure, and have it ready to go in your page. So
Yeah,
this
and
is the
that's
menu is
cool.
still glue code. That's not what you're doing. That is next level to give it into the hands of the real editor, of the real
Exactly.
project manager, whoever it may be. But it's already giving a lot more power to the single developer in our case.
Yeah, and that I think it's really good that you guys have all these extra props and this really specific language of what fits where, because then developers still have ownership of how something looks and works. And if you combine that then and put it in something like a DXC that is visual, it doesn't matter anymore which sources you add into it. They can still visually edit it with the language your design system has set. And
Yeah,
so,
and
yeah,
it's
it's
really
good
pervasive.
times,
You
right?
have those types, and you've talked about converting JSON schema. We're doing just that, for example, to create TypeScript types. So you
Yeah.
always know which properties you actually have. You can always leverage that to connect into different systems. And I think it's super powerful in the combination, especially.
This is great, man. Thank you so much. We're nearing the end of our stream today. Do you have anything else that you might want to share to our lovely viewers today? You maybe want to, market something about yourself, or otherwise, where can people find you?
Yeah, I don't think I have something too specific to market. If you're interested in design systems, and that's already not everybody probably that's attending this year. So if you're interested in that, have a look at Kickstart.ds maybe, because it's really interesting, I think, and a powerful approach to doing a design system, and it's open source. So there's no real investment there to be had to have a look at least. So I'd be really interested about that. And if you have questions about design systems, I think 3-4 weeks ago, we've launched a
Oh, I know
small
this one.
helper, the design system concierge, which you can actually ask questions to about design systems and get answers like you know from all those GPT plugins out there. And what we've done there, I think, is interesting again, because we're just not just generating an answer and having you live with that. We actually cite the sources. So we carefully select the sources inside a database we curate on our own, and those get referenced as context and rewritten into a nice answer. But you always get those sources linked below, and it's the expectation that you go into these sources, the one most fitting to you. Just go into there and really take a deep dive. That's how it's meant to be. That's why we called it the concierge. It's not your specialist. It's the guy at the front desk in the hotel. He doesn't know everything, but he's really helpful and he really wants to help you. So that's how
this one, I looked at this. This is a super fun way of using AI, but then have it not hallucinate too much.
Yeah.
So that's awesome to see. Thank you very much, Jonas. This is always fun. to have a chat. And I think it's time for me to re-dive into Kickstart DS because it's been a while, and just it's so much fun to see how this composable stuff can work. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
I never